Good afternoon, Paul. How are you, mate? My name is Tim Bowen, and today I'll be presenting a brief synopsis of the second case study, Why United States Export is So Competitive. On top of this, I'll also be applying relevant international business practices in the form of analysis and recommendations. Now, the aforementioned case study focuses around the falsehood of the common rhetoric regarding the decline in global competitiveness of US exports, stating that although China is overtaking it as a global export leader in recent years, the influence of the US in the global economy is by no means dwindling. The case study concludes by posing three focus questions. These touch on the social and ethical implications of negative reporting regarding the purported US export decline, as well as asking for an explanation of US export competitiveness from both institution and resource-based views. Now, these questions, paired with relevant recommendations for future focus, will form the basis of this presentation. Prior to undertaking this subject and reading this case study, I had often heard of the decline of US exports through the mainstream media platforms. However, upon reading further into this and conducting additional research into US exports, I can openly admit that the information I've read strongly refutes these claims. The sentiment that I had been subjected to was that US industry in general was diminishing, with many major players moving their operations to emerging economies in order to take advantage of globalization. Now, one example of this is Detroit, Michigan. Now, this was once the automobile epicenter of the United States, before Japan established competitiveness in the industry. As it stands, and also referring back to the textbook for this, the top-selling car in the US is now alternating between the Toyota Camry and the Honda Civic, which are both Japanese products. Now, this competitiveness led to Ford Motor Company reducing operations in Detroit in order to harness cheaper labor in elsewhere countries and establish a competitive edge in pricing. Now, there are numerous social and ethical implications that stem from biased reporting. Journalists have an ethical obligation to inform the public of all aspects of an issue. The onus then falls to the viewer to form their own opinion based upon the facts. Failure to do so will result in the swaying of the public to one side of an issue while keeping it fully ignorant of the consequences of doing so. So essentially, money is just purchasing public influence. Now, this perception can lead to the public choosing to ignore American exports, therefore weakening the US economy. Now, the dominant social implications that will result from this is higher levels of unemployment, which can then manifest in a loss of faith in education, as people are thrown out of jobs that they've studied to work their way into. The social repetition theories of that loss of faith in education, further class divide, and increase in crime as people turn to illegal matters to make a dollar. Now, the institution-based view suggests that the success and failure of firms around the globe are largely determined by their external environments. A resource-based viewpoint focuses on a firm's internal resources and capabilities. In the context of the US export economy, an institution-based view focuses upon formal institutions such as laws, regulations, and rules, as well as informal institutions such as values, cultures, ethics, and norms that impact American firms. The major formal institution contributing to US export competitiveness is its government. Now, the US government frequently campaigns for improved market access and terms of trade for its exporters. It has negotiated numerous free trade agreements, of which it currently has 20 in force with various countries. Now, these FTAs, they vastly help in the aspects of stability, transparency, and tariff reductions for US exporters. There are also a plethora of federal departments and agencies available to assist exporters, such as the Office of Trade Representatives, the Export-Import Bank, the US Agency of International Development, and so forth. With regards to informal institutions, there are multiple values, cultures, and norms both within America and shared across the globe that help to boost US export figures. Globalization has assisted American exporters vastly through the shaping of many other countries outside of it towards developing a culture of American consumption. Now, this is where the clothing, fast food, film, television, and dialogue has become the cultural norm. This can particularly be observed in Australia, where we are a very Americanized country. The domestic push within the US of valuing more sustainable practices with an eye towards reducing emissions is also contributing towards improved export figures. This new age culture of valuing sustainability has resulted in the gradual diminishment of national consumption of petroleum products over the previous decade. In response to this, the US has transformed much of its oil refinery practices towards exporting, further boosting the figures. In stark contrast to an institutional view, the resource-based view highlights the unique resources and capabilities of winning firms, as well as how they are acquired and developed, essentially focusing on the specific internal strengths and how competitive firms imitate them and attempt to innovate them, with the ultimate goal of outcompeting them. From a resource-based view, the biggest contributor towards US exports is the fact that many of them are rare and hard to imitate. These unique, organisationally embedded qualities are not shared by competitors in the same environments. Electrical and computer machinery, mineral fuels, aircraft, vehicles, medical apparatuses, plastics, precious metals, pharmaceuticals, and organic chemicals comprise the top 10 American exports. Of this list, we can observe that all of them, with perhaps the exception of plastic articles, require either immense manufacturing or engineering skill, or a home country blessed with bountiful natural resources. As previously stated, the global nature of US exports ensures that rival firms are consistently attempting to remodel American products in an attempt to gain the competitive advantage. In this scenario, the rare and hard to imitate qualities, as well as the firm's specific resources and capabilities, come to fruition, ensuring that the superior technical quality of US exports maintains market strength. This is also highlighted within the case study in the form of a comparison between the domestic value added towards exports of both the US and China. Of the $1.58 trillion exported in 2013 by America, 89% of the value occurred within its 89% of the value added occurred within its own borders. To contrast this, China exported $2.21 trillion in exports, however only added 69% of its values. The value added figures of 89% showcase the internal technical capabilities possessed by the US when preparing goods and services for export. One of the overwhelming positives to the American economy is that it remains so strong while also harbouring so much room for improvement. Future focus for US exporters involves that of diversification. As it stands, the current top 10 export categories account for 70% of all figures. 58% of American firms export to only one individual country, and only 1% of all firms within America geared towards exporting are doing so. These percentages can be improved through additional government assistance, with the end goal of the further cultivation of an exportation culture amongst American firms. No one can doubt the technical prowess of US service exports. However, there are notable trade deficits in electronics-related equipment, specifically computer electronics. This key deficit highlights a competitive disadvantage in the international electronics market, but also represents a key opportunity for the United States to improve its position in the global economy. It can do this through focused innovations and creative employment initiatives within its homeland. Now, two major export partners of the US are fortunately locked to it by land, these being Canada and Mexico. Together, these three economies comprise the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the NAFTA. Now, the election of President Trump into office and his promise to make America great again has thrown the NAFTA into uncertain waters. This is because Trump has threatened to place additional tariffs on goods and services entering the US from these countries, with the ultimate threat of just leaving the NAFTA altogether. So one example of this is Fiat Chrysler, which leverages its competitive advantage of cheaper labour, manufacturing in Mexico and shipping to the United States. This re-evaluation of the trade agreement could potentially lead to an additional 25% duty tax on such practices. Now, referring back to Trump again, the main target of his election to office is to return manufacturing jobs and return the sector back to its previous strength, so putting the jobs back in the hands of American people from those economies which possess cheaper labour. This, unfortunately, is in stark contrast to the worldwide trend of service trade figures. Now, these figures the service trade figures exceed the figures of those with goods. No one can dispute the world-renowned technical prowess of US service exports. That's essentially been the common theme of my presentation. All this short-term attention on manufacturing jobs will not help America's economic competitiveness down the road. Service exports are the key to US trade future, and sparking a trade war is not in the best interest of anyone. This has been my presentation. Thank you very much, mate. My name is Tim Bowen. Cheers.